Hi, heading into our fourth and final section of lecture 23, we're going to talk about the stress response. Something happens, it scares you, it threatens you, you perceive it as something that is a threat to your health, well-being, what have you. So your prefrontal cortex, your hippocampus are kind of processing memories to kind of understand this event. Your anterior cingulate cortex is framing it cognitively, just relax, it's just a spider, or like, oh my gosh, right? So, and your amygdala then, which we talked about, is important for fear, lights up and it sends a signal to the hypothalamus. And I am very afraid of spiders. So you see the spider and you send that information to your sensory cortex, but you're also sending that information to your hypothalamus down here, which that's not showing up very well. Let me try, I'm gonna use block actually. Right, so your hypothalamus, which is here, and your hypothalamus is going to do two things. One is it is what activates your sympathetic nervous system. So that fight or flight activity. The other thing it's going to do is activate what's called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, otherwise known as the HPA axis. Let's just take a moment to remember the sympathetic nervous system. That's one of the two main divisions of the autonomic nervous system, the other being the parasympathetic, which we see in green here. So recall that the sympathetic nervous system anatomically, the preganglionic neuron cell bodies are located in the thoracic and lumbar spinal cord. They have short axons that come out to synapse with the postganglionic neurons. They use acetylcholine, and then they synapse with the postganglionic neurons that are located in the sympathetic chain, which is that structure that is just outside of the spine and the spinal cord. And then there are long axons that go from the postganglionic neuron cell bodies to the target organ, where it's going to release norepinephrine as the neurotransmitter. So it's going to dilate our pupils so we can see better. It's going to inhibit saliva production, making our mouth go dry because now is not the time to be eating and digesting. It's going to dilate and open up our bronchi so that we can get more oxygen in more quickly. It's going to increase our heart rate so we can send more oxygen and glucose throughout our body more quickly. It's going to suppress digestive activity and all the organs in there. And then remember, it's also going to stimulate the adrenal medulla to release adrenaline. They have on this diagram adrenaline and noradrenaline, which are now referred to as epinephrine and norepinephrine. So that's going to help mobilize energy stores and all these things that are going to help us respond to this threat, fight or flight. Now, what's the HPA axis about? So the hypothalamus, in addition to activating the sympathetic nervous system, is also going to release a hormone called corticotropin releasing hormone, or CRH for short. So in this diagram from the Hedges textbook here, this is just the most inferior part of the hypothalamus. We can see some neuron cell bodies there, and they are releasing CRH into this special little circulation, this special little collection of blood vessels between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. It's a portal circulation, which you might remember as one where blood goes from capillaries to veins and then to capillaries again before it goes into veins again. You might remember the hepatic portal system for our digestive organs so that our liver can process that blood before it goes into the general bloodstream. Anyhow, then the pituitary is going to respond by releasing ACTH, which is the adrenocorticotropic hormone. Now that sounds like a real mouthful, but adreno means adrenal, so it's going to go to the adrenal glands. Cortico means it's going to go to the cortex of the adrenal glands, and trophic just means that that's where it goes. So the hormone is basically named hormone that goes to the adrenal cortex, which is the adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH for short. When it gets there, it is going to stimulate the adrenal cortex, that outer part of the adrenal glands, to release cortisol, which is a hormone that is generally known as the stress hormone, that is going to induce a more longer lasting stress response. This is just a little diagram of the same thing. So the hypothalamus is going to release corticotropin releasing hormone, which tells the pituitary gland to release ACTH, which tells the adrenal gland to make cortisol and release it into the bloodstream and send it to the entire body. I just want to acknowledge that the adrenal glands do a lot. So we already learned about how in response to the sympathetic nervous system, they release epinephrine and norepinephrine. Now we've talked about how in response to ACTH, they release cortisol. So there are other things that they do as well, but we're just focusing on those two for now. Now, cortisol in an acutely stressful situation is very helpful. It helps your body, again, we're responding to this acute threat. It helps further mobilize energy stores by releasing glucose and stored fats and things so that we can get energy quickly if we need to run or fight so our muscles have no shortage of fuel. It's going to increase our blood pressure, which is going to help deliver more blood, which is carrying those nutrition resources, that fuel, to our cells more quickly. It also sharpens attention and memory. Like sometimes if you're really like, when you're locked in, or like maybe something's due soon, or you're taking an exam and you're really on fire mentally, that could be due to the cortisol secretion. It also helps you form some memories. So things that happen when you're under acute stress are things that you tend to remember. And it decreases your sensitivity to pain, which could also be very useful depending on the situation. It can also help stimulate wound healing and help you heal wounds faster. Now, it's also going to do some other things, which we're going to talk about on the next slide. So in general, in an acutely stressful short-term situation, cortisol is a helpful thing to enable your body to respond to whatever the threat may be. The problem arises if you have high cortisol levels all the time. Cortisol levels are not meant to be high all the time. It's meant to be a short-term support to help you get through an acutely difficult situation. If, however, you have chronic stress, could be from a variety of things, a very bad work situation, challenging economic circumstances, an unhealthy or abusive relationship, overwork, trying to do too many things. It could be lots of different things. That actually is associated with worse health outcomes. So what we see in people that are under chronic stress, that have chronically elevated levels of cortisol, it doesn't go back down because the stress just doesn't stop. We see higher incidence of some mental health symptoms. We see weakened immune response. We see increased rates of heart disease, higher blood pressure, higher blood sugar, increased rates of diabetes. We see digestive problems, and we also sometimes see nerve problems, usually mostly with like concentration and attention. This is one of the ways that we think that when we see certain groups, demographic groups, whose health is much worse, we think this is why. So when we look at groups that are historically marginalized or discriminated against, so people of color or the LGBTQIA community, for example, that are often persecuted in a variety of ways, either intentional or not, by society, we think this is part of why they often have worse health outcomes. It's not something genetically different at all. It's that they're under this chronic stress. So what if your life is chronically stressful? What if you are part of a minority situation? Or what if you have a really bad job situation, but you can't afford to leave it right now, or you can't afford to change it right now? There are things that you can do to help manage it in a way that will help reduce your cortisol levels and help maintain your health. So certainly mindfulness meditation or mindfulness-based stress reduction techniques have been studied and are very helpful. Also working on that cognitive reappraisal. So when we talked about emotional regulation, you can actually use it for this through that cognitive behavioral therapy. If you can see something not as like this overwhelming, horrible thing that is happening to you and there's nothing you can do about it, rather than if instead of seeing it like that, you see it as a challenge to overcome, reframing that has actually been shown to be helpful. Interestingly, helping others deal with their stress helps decrease your cortisol levels. So if you have a friend who's like their house is just a mess, or they haven't been able to mow their lawn, whatever, and you go over and you do it for them, that actually decreases your cortisol levels. So that's kind of cool. And then anything that you can do to support healthy behaviors for your own self, right? Anything you can do to help your body function at its most optimal. So getting good sleep, eating nutritious foods, moving your body regularly, all of those things can actually have a big impact. The other thing that I want to point out is that agency also matters. And what I mean by agency here is when we talk about somebody having agency over something, that means they have some control over it. There's something that they can do, they have some autonomy, they can change their circumstances in some way, shape, or form. So the Whitehall study is a very famous study that looked at British civil servants longitudinally over time. And it started back in the 80s, and they thought, well, certainly like the people who are the big bosses, like their job is so stressful. They work long hours. They're making these incredibly big, complicated, difficult decisions. Surely they're going to have more heart attacks than anyone else. And that was certainly kind of just the pervasive feeling at the time. They were very surprised then to find when they looked at likelihood of coronary heart disease, which is what the graph is showing us here, it wasn't the CEOs and the bosses and the top level managers who had the stressful jobs, who had the highest rates of heart disease. It was actually people at the low end of the totem pole. And what they found to be the most predictive of the worst health outcomes was having low job control. So they interviewed one guy who was a custodial worker. And he was like, yeah, they send me here and I start working on this area, and then they call me and they say, no, actually, we need you to be over on this floor and we need you to go clean that. And he's like, but I haven't even finished this. And they're like, well, hurry up. And, he just didn't have any control over his job. So they especially found if you had high demands and low control, that combination was especially problematic. So if you look at this, the people who had low job control, and this is when they controlled for income and they controlled for other risk factors, they had a 2 times higher rate of heart disease than the people who had a lot of control and autonomy. So however you can exert control or autonomy over your situation, that is helpful. It can be something really simple, which is a kind of another example of cognitive reframing. When I was in residency, I was literally working 60 to over 100 hours a week, many weeks, up at all night, very high stakes, busy. If I made a mistake, somebody might die. It was really, really, really difficult work. And at times I just felt absolutely overwhelmed. But I found it helpful to say to myself, well, you could quit. You could just go work at McDonald's, right? You have a choice here. Maybe you don't like the other options, but if you stay, you are choosing to stay. And just acknowledging that you do have a choice. The other options might not be very good, or the other options available to you at that time might not be very good, but you do have a choice, can be very helpful. So however you can find some agency and control, even if it's just in your mind over a situation, can be helpful. Okay, so in summary, the stress response, we have some type of perceived threat, which is determined to be so by the thalamus, the hippocampus, the insula, the prefrontal cortex, and the anterior cingulate cortex. Can't believe I left that out. The amygdala activates, which then activates the hypothalamus, which then activates the sympathetic nervous system. We get our fight or flight response, including stimulation of the adrenal medulla to make norepinephrine. And it also activates the HPA axis, where the hypothalamus releases CRH, which causes the pituitary to release ACTH, which causes the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. Cortisol is very beneficial to us in the short term, right? Increases glucose and blood pressure so our body can respond. But over the long term, if cortisol is chronically elevated, it is actually detrimental to our health. But there are things that you can do to help manage chronic stress. All right, that's it for lecture 23.